Hey guys, welcome back to World of Warships. Today we get to talk about the Johnston. Finally, I'm sure a lot of you have been anticipating this ship's release in World of Warships, and it's finally here. This, of course, is a Fletcher class destroyer that had some pretty intense action and combat in World War II. I'll leave that towards more history-focused channels for you to get the more complete story from. But in World of Warships, this is a full gunboat destroyer. This is Fletcher class with sap shells. So you get a burst fire with sap, dealing an immense amount of damage each burst fire. That is the whole gimmick here of Johnston. Your gunpower is extreme, and in these burst fires, you can do upwards of 10,000 damage, I think. Maybe a little bit more if you get the perfect scenario, but I would say on average, it's around that 5,000 to 6,000 damage per burst, which is really, really, really good. There's a lot to cover here when it comes to the changes to these guns, including the DPM figures, because this ship actually, with its burst fire, has better DPM than it does normally. So this is a ship you're going to want to play with this burst fire almost all the time. There's only a few scenarios where I can think I wouldn't be using my burst fire all the time. But we'll get into that a little bit later. For now though, how can you get this ship? That is the question. Well, it is available in the premium shop. And I'm assuming that's going to be full priced tier 9. I actually don't know the cost up ahead. So in giving you a recommendation whether or not to get this ship, I'm just going off the assumption it's around that similar cost to other tier 9s of like 19,000 to 20,000 doubloons, which is not cheap in this game. It's also coming as a part of this event with Rhode Island finally available, not in loot boxes. So we'll take a look at that probably tomorrow, just a more updated look at that ship. But for today, just the Johnston. The ship's also going to be available as a possible drop in the Wings of Freedom containers, so it will be available in loot boxes. But as always, I'm going to recommend you guys don't go for the loot boxes. Just spend the money outright, and that way you know exactly what you're getting for your money, and not at risk of gambling and not getting anything. As for the Wings of Freedom containers, the Johnston is replacing Georgia in those containers. So something to keep in mind if you are getting some of those containers. And let's be honest, there's a lot of different options to spend your money on in World of Warships, especially right now. This last update had a lot of events to just spend money on, and that also includes the Wisconsin Dockyard, still available for just a little bit more. So Johnston, Rhode Island, Wisconsin full buyout, as well as some of these other Three Kingdoms events. There's a lot out there. So with Johnston probably being that full tier 9 price, again, I wish I knew the exact number. I'm just assuming that it's that full tier 9 price. It's not cheap, and there are a lot of other options to spend your money on. So this better be a good ship if you're going to be spending your money on it. Outside of the historical significance, of course, I'm mostly focused on the gameplay elements of World of Warships. I totally get it if you're getting this thing for the historical side, but I'll be mostly evaluating it from that gameplay perspective. So with that out of the way, what can this ship do relative to the other tier 9 destroyers? Let's talk DPM. Outright DPM is bad without this burst fire. So as for the HE DPM compared to a Fletcher, because I think that's going to be a very common comparison here, this ship has way worse HE DPM. So 120,000 HE DPM versus Fletcher's 161,000. With your burst fire though, it actually pretty much equals it. The Johnston burst, of course, is a 3-round burst, and you get that in 1.4 second intervals with a 9-second reload afterwards. So if you add all those up, it gives you about 13.2 seconds to fire 4 salvos out of this ship. That's the same as a Fletcher firing 4 salvos. So that makes things easy for us to really understand the DPM aspect here. You get bursted out the same amount of salvos that Fletcher would be sending out in the same amount of time. You just get them more condensed with a longer space in between, which is very interesting, I gotta say. it does lend this ship to a more hit and run style, I guess. It also gives you the opportunity to deal much more damage when a ship is the most vulnerable. We see that a lot with battleships where we hold our shot for a ship to go broadside. I think you're going to want to do that with Johnston as well. Here, making sure that the Jaeger is going to be at least somewhat broadside. The sap shells here do have decent pen angles, but if you fully angle to them, they will be bouncing. And we get some pretty massive damage. This game was my best game, and it's arms race. So unfortunately, you're seeing a super powerful version of the Johnston. I gotta say, I had a pretty rough time with this ship overall, though. I think it's very good. I think it can be very strong. But I gotta say it, guys. It's a tier 9 ship. I gotta say it. You know what's coming. The Matchmaker. The Matchmaker. It's rough these days for a tier 9. I've been going through the coal ships recently. We've got a lot of tier 9s in the coal ships, and rating them, re-reviewing them for 2024 has been quite difficult in random battles, as you're oftentimes pulled up into those super ship, those tier 10 games, and they struggle into those matches. And Johnston is no different. And I think part of that comes down to the ship's design, and I'll get into that later, where I think it could have been designed in a way that would have been more fun for the current meta than it currently is. But you're seeing pretty much the best possible scenario for a Johnston. Arms race with a massive down tier, allowing us to fight a bunch of tier 7s. And we're getting those full reload and full damage buffs. So look at these salvos, man. The sap is just disgusting into this King George. The nice thing about this sap, I should get on to that. We're going to run out of time. There's so much to talk about. Okay, the sap shells actually do 2,500 alpha damage per shell. That's significant because the San Diego is a tier 8 Atlanta with a reload booster. San Diego is a very interesting ship there as well, having sap. Those sap shells do 1,800 alpha damage, the exact same as the HE shells do on that ship. So this Johnston having 2,500 alpha for these 127mm guns is significant. It allows this sap to be much better. It feels much better. My main complaint when playing San Diego is that the sap doesn't actually feel all that impactful because you're doing basically the same damage as the HE would be doing, with, for sure, more pen. The pen here being 36mm, allowing us to easily pen battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the pen angles being 65 to 70 degrees means we are very easily going to be landing full pens, even on very angled ships. It is very strong, these sap shells, but the problem is this DPM overall isn't actually the best at the tier. So you do have to deal with things like the Groningen and the Friesland. Those are the best HE DPM ships at tier 9 as far as destroyers go, with 233,000 HE DPM. So if we look at the potential best that Johnston can do for DPM with the sap shells there, it's around 227,000. Very rough math there, of course. I'm not exactly sure if there's some delays or anything like that, but just trying to extrapolate out that 4-round burst, those 4 salvos, right? We get the 3-round burst and then the 9 seconds to get back to that start of the burst. Gives us 227,000-ish. My math could be wrong on that, but I am going with that as a ballpark, which does mean we're like second best at tier 9, which is very good. However, we have worse shell velocity or worse shell flight time compared to a Friesland or Groningen, and that means these shells are pretty floaty out to range, and you're not going to be open water gunboating quite as much because this ship hasn't really been changed from Fletcher. As a tier 9 destroyer, it's got decent HP, it's got decent maneuverability, but it still is going to lose a lot of HP. It's a very vanilla ship, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think Fletcher's actually a very strong ship. Before playing Johnston, I actually played a bunch of Fletcher and a little bit of Mogador to give myself an idea of what these tier 9 gunboat hybrid boats are looking like these days. And I actually had a really good time in Fletcher. It's a very good DD these days. Again, very dependent on the matchmaker, as all tier 9s are. And Johnston, I was surprised, actually. I was actually very surprised by Johnston and how I felt like it wasn't all that different from the Fletcher. And that really surprised me because I thought this was going to be a very, very different experience. And now afterwards, and before making this video, looking into some of the DPM calculations for this burst fire, it kind of makes sense to me why this ship felt like a decent side grade to Fletcher, where we do sure have sap and this really, really nice burst fire to give us that very punchy, impactful damage all at once. It doesn't have that much extra DPM that it makes me feel like, wow, look at this gunboat. I think an unfair comparison, but one I will make, is to the Forest Sherman, okay? That ship has 324,000 sap DPM. That is a lot, okay? And let me get gearing up here for a second. Gearing has 216,000 HE DPM. That is a substantial increase in DPM, where Johnston, it's there, but not as extreme. Although, to be fair to the Johnston, it does still retain torpedoes, and it actually has longer range torps than the Fletcher does, which allows it to more comfortably play into these higher tier metas. And that's really, really nice. I don't want to discount that. Having 13.5 kilometer range torps versus 10.5 kilometer range torps is a big deal, and it really comes down to radar ranges in this game. 12 kilometers is a somewhat common radar range, 10 kilometers for sure. And allowing you to torp from outside that range just makes a ship feel much more comfortable to play. There's less scenarios where you feel like you're just locked out of the match and you can't do anything. That's really good. The problem being the DPM gets absolutely murdered. Poor Johnston has very, very long reload, 170-second reload base on these torpedoes, where the Fletcher gets 106-second reload. And Fletcher also has a little more alpha damage, not by too much though. Johnston at 17,900, Fletcher at just over 19,000. Not a big difference there, but it is something. The speed on the torps is also going to be the same. Another small but important distinction between Johnston and the Fletcher is actually going to be your speed. Johnston gets up to almost 40 knots, where Fletcher can't quite make it there. Their base speeds, of course, are going to be 36.5 knots on the Fletcher and Johnston being at 38. So with a speed flag, you're getting just shy of 40 knots on Johnston. And then you have your consumables. You still have that same very useful American smoke that lasts a very, very long time. There's some nice team play opportunities with that, but also just for yourself to farm out of is very useful on a ship that does not have a heal. So we can kind of think of that smoke as a bit of a survivability tool as well. But it's the same as the Fletcher. Also the same as Fletcher is going to be your speed boost at 8%. It's a very standard speed boost, but nice because it's already adding to a faster ship. So it does have a little bit of extra speed, which does make it a little more comfortable to play than the Fletcher. And the last little change that I'll talk about here is that your range is slightly worse at 12.5 kilometers of range versus the 12.9 that Fletcher does have. And that is a minor difference, but for a ship that is more focused on its guns compared to a Fletcher, to have worse range does feel a little bit bad. Although, don't go taking range mod with this ship, because again, we do not have the shell velocity to support range mod. That's another thing where Sherman does feel like such an amazing jump up in gunpower compared to gearing. It has a lot of compromises to get that though with Sherman, but it does have the shell velocity to allow it to take more range and use all that extra DPM. With the Johnston, I feel like this ship could have just been a Fletcher with sap, to be honest with you, without a burst fire. And it would have been great because our extra damage, our extra DPM there that I talked about earlier, where based on my calculations, which could be off to be fair, is around 227,000 DPM with the sap and our burst fire. That extra damage is because of the shells doing more damage. It's not because we're getting any sort of extra DPM or reload advantage there compared to the Fletcher. So if we had a Johnston be just a sap version of a Fletcher, maybe then we could have seen some other changes to the ship, like say a heal. And yeah, this is where I think Johnston could have been changed to be a much more enjoyable ship, a much more interesting ship. it is very dangerous to be just full gunboat, especially on a Fletcher, because your shell velocity is not really good enough to support it. Your smoke screens are very nice for dealing a lot of damage out of, but with your limited range shell velocity, it means that you have to get quite close to the enemies. And are you really going to give yourself 2 minutes in a smoke, and a battleship, a cruiser, a destroyer is going to stay spotted for that whole time within that 12.5 kilometer range? It's possible, but in a situation like this one, where, by the way, I'm going to spot over 100 torpedoes in this game. Torps are a bit of an issue with this thing too. I tried to add in a few clips, but I think I died 3 or 4 times in recording for this ship just to torpedoes, because I was trying to play it aggressive, man. But it's hard. It's hard to play this thing aggressive. We get the nice burst. Look at the damage into this Delarna. Again, super ship matchmaker, by the way. Fortunately, this Delarna does not believe he owns any guns on his ship. Very nice for me, but it does mean that we don't actually catch him here, because he gets to go dark, because he didn't actually shoot. But still, very nice damage. The burst into broadsides is very nice. And to me, that's where the extra damage comes in for Johnston. I've already talked about gearing to Sherman. It just, in every way, is such an amazing step up in gunpower that there's really no competition there. Johnston to Fletcher, your damage output, your damage increase is from the sap shells doing more damage, and the burst fire allowing you to concentrate that damage into the most vulnerable portion of a ship's engagement, which is when they're broadside at close range, like that Delarna was. Those are the best case scenarios. Any other time, you're just standard farming a battleship from smoke, or you're into a destroyer who's kiting away from you, cruisers that aren't perfectly broadside. Those times are where the burst fire is really not helping you out with damage at all. And it's really just that sap giving you the 36 mil pen that allows you to deal good, solid damage into cruisers and battleships where the HE just would not be penning. The HE, though, to be fair, does have the option of lighting fires, which we don't have here with the sap. This ship does have HE too, by the way, but I really didn't use it all that much. The only times I really was using the high explosive is when there was a bow-on battleship or cruiser where I was just bouncing my sap shells, which doesn't happen very often because, again, the pen angles are so good on this sap. So I think Johnston is good, but I have I'm seriously conflicted about this ship in thinking that it's that much better than a Fletcher. That Torp DPM, man, it is so painful. And there are so many times in these matches where I was playing Johnston. And again, I played Johnston quite a bit here, and I played Fletcher quite a bit before playing it. So it's very fresh in my mind how good Fletcher is and what it's capable of. The lack of torpedo reload was so disappointing on this ship. There were so many opportunities where I just wish my torps were up 30 seconds faster, and I would have had great opportunities to have at least some potential to damage some of these cruisers or battleships, where the gunpower I didn't feel like was enough for me to start open water gunboating them all the time. This is an example of a game where we're going to just get absolutely blown out. In a super ship game, I'm going to have to try and carry, and it's not going to go all that well. I'm getting greedy here, by the way. This is like, I'm thinking, oh, I'll reverse into my smoke and start gunboating. No, we should be running, because that is a Kitakami, a Delarna, a Jaeger, and a Fletcher, all trying to torp me out. And to be fair, I have teammates behind me, so maybe they're just dual purpose or triple purpose torpedoes for the smoke screen I had, and then my teammates behind. But a very, very, very rough game here to end on, where Johnston, I didn't feel like I had the gunpower to push terribly aggressively. And that gets me into what I think, or what I wish this ship would have been. A ship with a heel. Make this into a tier 9 version of the Kid with sap. That would have been amazing. Kid is a tier 8 Fletcher hull that has a heel, but it removes a torpedo launcher just to make up for that. It also doesn't have access to the 6th upgrade slot, but otherwise it's a Fletcher at tier 8. And it's got some decent DPM, the same DPM as Fletcher with its HE, same shell velocity problems, but that heel allows it to play so aggressively. And sure, the extra sap damage and the burst fire allows you to play aggressively sometimes, but it doesn't allow you to make a mistake or play so aggressive that you take some trade damage, and then you can heal it back later and then come back stronger, or come back and re-engage as a ship with more HP. So for me, that's where I find Johnston to be just a little bit disappointing, is that it doesn't have that gunboat brawler playstyle that I've been accustomed to with the Kid. And that's kind of what this ship's being hyped up as. It's the brawler, gunboat, knife fighter, action-packed destroyer. And it gets that way because of this extra DPM that I've already stated is not so much extra that it allows me to play that aggressively. As we've already talked about, it's not so outlier DPM like the Sherman might be with its sap and the shell velocity there that it allows me to just fully DPM gunboat it and not really care about being spotted all that much. And we don't have a heal there, but it's okay because we have that insane gun power and the shell velocity and damage to support that. This ship does not have the range or the shell velocity to support that guns a-blazing roll, and if we use the concealment, which is very good, that's something it has over Sherman, the concealment and maneuverability, we're going to do very good things to cap contest and deal with destroyers in that way, but not having a heal means that we are very, very vulnerable to taking one slightly bad engagement and suddenly our entire gimmick of being this gun build presence on the battlefield is suddenly just evaporated, and we have to play very passively then. And then when we're trying to play passively on low HP, after we've taken that potentially poor engagement early on, then we're reliant on very bad torpedo DPM, which admittedly has some nice range to it, and maybe some of our smoke screens to fire out of. So it's a very weird ship. It has the potential to be absolutely game-breaking in ranked. This is the part where I say again, with any tier 9 ship, it feels like whenever I'm talking about them, play them in ranked and brawls, and anytime you can fight your own tier, suddenly the tier 9 ships look pretty good again. But when you're mostly pulled up into tier 10, and I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm pulled into more super ship games than I am against tier 8s even, with these tier 9s these days. So it is rough out there in random battles for the matchmaker on these ships. I think Johnston has some cool gimmicks, but not having a heal, man, it just feels like such a wasted opportunity to bring a gunboat version of a Fletcher. The other thing they could have done is given it better shell velocity or flatter arcs like the Sherman has. You know, you don't need to give it quite the alpha of Sherman, which is that 2700, but they gave it 2500 alpha. That's really good. Give it maybe the middle ground shell velocity, which is the Humphreys, the Joshua Humphreys at super ships, the super gearing. It does not have the shell flight time of the Sherman, but it's much better than gearing, and it makes it much more comfortable to play. Maybe give Johnston that gimmick as well. I don't know, but these things make this ship very, very difficult to play, where your shell velocity is so bad that at 10 kilometers, it feels like you're leading a target at 20 or 25 kilometers in a cruiser or something like that. It's very, very difficult to lead these shells at range. So then you want to play closer. And when you play closer, that's where you have to deal with a decent amount of HP. 20,000 is fine, but nothing too impressive in my opinion. And it dies quick. It dies quick if you overcook it. And for a ship that wants to be that very aggressive, in-your-face, burst fire sap build, it's a little disappointing to me. I honestly, in random battles, would take a Fletcher over this. And that's not like, keep in mind, for me, I find Fletcher to be one of the better tier 9 random DDs because it's just so good at everything. I don't think Johnston's guns are enough of a positive over the Fletcher to make up for the massive weakness in the torpedoes here. And that's a bit of an issue. But it might be down to the matchmaker I was getting, to be fair. Those super ship games are rough with this ship, and I didn't get the opportunities to farm like I might otherwise be able to, since, as you saw with that last game, I mean, dealing with a lot of torp boats, man, it is hard. It is very, very, very difficult to deal with that. And then I guess the other thing to consider with this ship is you don't have the range to really farm battleships outside of secondary range. Like, I'm saying this ship is going to be a monster in ranked, and it sure will be for that cap contest role. That burst fire as you're in that cap contest engagement is going to be just extremely powerful and very difficult to deal with. But anytime you have to deal with a pushing Pommern or Ruprecht or something like that with secondaries, you're not really going to be able to open water farm him without taking a bunch of damage from those secondaries. Again, we don't even have like French saturation mechanics or anything like that. So these HP points evaporate rather quickly. So you're going to have to find opportunities to smoke up or use islands to farm those battleships so that you don't just bleed HP that then will compromise you in your next destroyer engagement. But then you have to have someone else spotting for you if you're going to farm a secondary brawler battleship in ranked. And that's very specific, of course, but I mean, let's be honest, tier 9 ranked, there's a lot of those secondary battleships out there in those game modes. So very weird ship. And I guess the main reason I'm being so hard on it here towards the end, even though I do think it's a very cool ship and could be very, very fun to play, this burst is honestly great in those initial DD engagements. It's very fun with the sap. It's just expensive, right? It's just expensive. We got to get back to that. The cost of these tier 9 ships is not cheap. I'm assuming it's going to be equal price to, let's say, Groningen, right? And Groningen's very unique as well. It's got more DPM, but it doesn't have the torpedoes, but it gets a hydro as well. It's slower though, clumsier, worse concealment. But Groningen's got more DPM. But it's very expensive. So that could be a bit of an issue there. It's a very expensive ship. So overall, Johnston, very, very cool ship from history coming into the game. Awesome to see. Even if it is just another Fletcher, this one's got some seriously amazing backstory to it and historical significance to it. So it's really good to see it in the game. Gameplay-wise, a little compromised in my opinion. They gave it a slight buff to the gunpower, but did not buff its survivability to help it deal with that increased gunpower. And in these up tiers, that little bit of extra gunpower doesn't really matter against those higher tier ships, as they are much, much more powerful. Into ranked games, this thing's going to be great. Into its own tier, it's going to be great. Into those down tiers in random battles, it will just be feasting, as we saw initially. I think this is a really fun ship, but I personally would not be interested in it for the gameplay elements, just because random battles are too difficult with a tier 9 these days. And into tier 9 ranked battles, well, there's this thing called the Black, where that ship has Fletcher DPM, so a little bit worse than this burst fire sap, but you get a radar with it, and that utility is amazing. To be fair, though, this will be good at countering Black, now that I'm thinking about it. I did fight one a little bit earlier, but I torped him out. Got very lucky with that. That initial spot each other, the Black smokes up and then radars you from smoke. You get to smash him with your first burst, and that should help you deal with him. I just can't help but think of a heal, man. I can't think a heal with this sap shells here, but no burst fire, just normal reload, but give it a heal, man. Oh, it would have been, what could have been, but maybe that'll come later. I just really like Kid at tier 8 as a gunboat, and seeing a tier 9 version with sap would have been so cool. But that's going to do it for today's video on the Johnston. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm going to have to play this thing a bunch more just to get a more firm grasp of what it's capable of. Are you going to be getting this ship? Are you excited about this ship? Let me know. And that's going to do it. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. But wait, didn't he forget about the build? Yes. Yes, he did forget about the build. So many thoughts that I totally forgot to show you guys. Running a gunboat build certainly is a good idea with this ship, where the guns are the focus. So I did try it with Fearless Brawler, but I've already went on and on enough about the lack of a heal and the survivability issue with open water gunboating. Fearless Brawler might not be the best fit for this ship, in my opinion. Tried to fill the tubes to make up for that insane torpedo DPM loss, and it was still pretty miserable, so maybe not worth speccing into that. I would not recommend range because the shells are so floaty. If it had the same shell velocity as Humphreys even, maybe range could be an idea. Certainly with Sherman shell velocity we'd go range, but not in this case. Maybe a Dazzle build? I don't know. The more I think about it, the more possibilities there are to try and make this ship work, but it's not just this outright insane gunboat build Fletcher, where that's what Sherman really is to the gearing at tier 10. I earlier compared this ship a lot to Sherman, And it's not because I think the Johnston should be as powerful as Sherman. I should have made this clear. I just find that Sherman is the SAP gunboat version of a gearing. It's the tier 10 American destroyers. One of them is the Jack of all trades, one of them is the gunboat. Johnston is kind of leaning towards that tier 9 American gunboat DD, where the Fletcher is the Jack of all trades. And I'm trying to compare the differences there, where the Sherman is much better in certain ways than the gearing that allows it to play that strong gunboat role. And Johnston, relative to Fletcher, isn't as far down that gunboat route that makes me want to play that full build, if that makes sense. Probably didn't explain it all that well, honestly, because I need to play the ship more to just get a better feel for it, understand it better. Hopefully I get more down tiers where I get to play a little bit less against super ships, a little more against my own tier. Yeah, but now for real this time. That is the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.